In the year 1884, just beyond the restless hum of New York's expanding factories and soot-darkened streets, stood a mansion unlike any other. A vast structure drenched in a brilliant scarlet paint that caught the fading sunlight like a warning. To the casual observer, the house promised wealth, refinement, and a certain rare luxury, perched on the outskirts where old farmland met the creeping sprawl of industry. Its tall windows gleamed as if alive, reflecting dreams of success and hope, while the manicured gardens whispered of careful cultivation and order. Yet beneath this polished surface lay a secret darker than the black smoke billowing from the city's chimneys. The mansion's walls held a silence that was not peaceful but deliberate, like the quiet before a storm. And that silence weighed heavier than the thick air of the summer evening. Its owner, Jonathan Harrow, was a man whose reputation was as neatly constructed as his house, a gentleman of means and taste, known for his charm and quiet manners. To the city's elite, his invitation to stay under the crimson roof was a coveted opportunity, a chance to step away from the chaos into a sanctuary of sophistication. But no one who entered the mansion ever left unchanged. Behind the velvet curtains and polished oak, Harrow's true nature hid in plain sight. He was a predator who cloaked himself in normalcy, a master of appearances who used hospitality as a lure. His fascination was not with the guests themselves, but with what he could unravel inside them, their fears, their sanity, their very souls. The house itself seemed complicit, its long corridors twisting and folding in ways that made guests question their own memories, the rooms subtly rearranging, trapping minds as well as bodies. The air inside was thick with a scent that defied description, a mixture of old wood, faint chemicals, and something metallic and cold, like the promise of pain beneath silk sheets. Guests spoke in hushed tones of restless nights, dreams haunted by whispers and shadows that slid just beyond vision. But these tales were dismissed as the imaginings of city folk unused to solitude. Yet the truth was far more sinister. The mansion was a vessel for methodical cruelty, its owner an architect of suffering who took care not to stain the outside world with his acts. Jonathan Harrow was meticulous, his rituals hidden beneath the charm of polished silverware and the smooth pouring of wine. He watched his guests like a scientist, noting their reactions and their unraveling sanity, all while maintaining the mask of the perfect host. To him, the house was a living instrument of control, each room a chamber of psychological decay designed to strip away the defenses of his unwilling participants. This was no ordinary cruelty. It was a slow-burning ritual, a dance of shadows and silence where each act was measured, deliberate, and symbolic. The guests arrived full of hope or ambition, unaware that their stay would twist their minds and leave them marked forever. The mansion was a crimson beacon, but one that warned of a feast of horrors hidden beneath the surface, a place where innocence was devoured and replaced by something colder, something broken. As night fell, the city's lights twinkled in the distance, indifferent to the dark history being written behind those scarlet walls, a history that would unravel the facade of civility and expose the monstrous mind hiding in plain sight. Jonathan Harrow was a man who could walk into any room and command attention with a simple, calm smile. The kind of smile that promised warmth and kindness but hid sharp edges beneath its curve. To those who met him briefly, he was the perfect gentleman, polite, well-dressed, and attentive, a figure who seemed as ordinary as the countless others in New York's growing elite. Yet behind that polished exterior was a fractured mind, a mind obsessed with control in ways few could understand. The neighbors who lived close to the mansion spoke quietly of strange habits and unnerving silence that surrounded Harrow's life. They noticed the times he would stand alone in the garden at night, eyes fixed on nothing visible, whispering to himself as if in conversation with invisible forces. Some swore they saw symbols carved faintly into the mansion's red walls, marks too subtle for the untrained eye but unmistakable to those who studied secret languages. Harrow's days were marked by rigid routines, each action measured and repeated with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. His obsession with ritual was not just eccentricity. It was a way to assert absolute power over the chaos he feared inside himself. He believed the human mind was a fragile vessel, capable of unraveling like thread caught on a thorn, and he set out to explore that unraveling as a scientist studies a specimen. His fascination with control extended to the guests he invited, each arrival a new opportunity to test the limits of fear and submission. To Harrow, the mansion was not simply a home but a laboratory, and its inhabitants his experiments. Behind closed doors, he conducted rituals that were equal parts ceremony and cruelty, designed to strip away layers of identity until only raw, exposed terror remained. There was a methodical calm to his madness, a slow burning fire that consumed without roaring. His rituals used symbols and objects that most would find disturbing. Silk threads stained with unknown substances, mirrors cracked and rearranged to distort reflections, and the careful arrangement of bones and herbs in patterns that seemed to pulse with unseen energy. Yet to those who only saw the surface, Harrow remained the quiet host, the man who poured drinks with steady hands and listened with feigned interest to the idle talk of his guests. His ability to hide the darkness within him was a testament to his mastery of masks. The mansion reflected this duality, a place where beauty and horror intertwined so tightly that separating one from the other became impossible. As the nights grew longer, and the guests began to sense the shifting air, Harrow's presence grew heavier, an unseen force pressing down, guiding them toward the edge of reason. Beneath his composed exterior lurked a mind that found joy in the slow disintegration of others, a mind that reveled in the delicate dance between trust and betrayal, sanity and madness. This was a man who understood that true evil does not shout. It whispers, it waits, and it works in silence, carefully threading its influence through the fragile seams of the human soul. The arrival of guests to the Red Mansion was always an event cloaked in an eerie formality, as if stepping through its heavy doors marked a passage from the known world into something far more uncertain. Artists, businessmen, and socialites all walked the gravel path with hopes and ambitions tucked behind polite smiles, unaware that their steps were measured and timed by the unseen host. They came seeking refuge from the relentless pace of the city, eager for a night or two away from their own private struggles, or drawn by the promise of mingling with those of wealth and influence. But the mansion demanded its own price for hospitality, a price paid in subtle distortions and creeping unease. From the moment they crossed the threshold, guests sensed a shift. not in the house's outward grandeur, but in something more intangible, like the air itself bending around them. The halls stretched longer than memory allowed. Doorways seemed to shift when backs were turned, and staircases twisted in ways that defied architectural logic. These changes were not random but deliberate, crafted by Harrow's obsession with control and isolation. Physically trapped in a building that refused to remain constant, the guests found themselves emotionally untethered as well. Conversations fell into strained silences. Glances flickered with suspicion. Familiar faces began to feel like strangers. The mansion's layout became a mirror for the unraveling of their own minds, each room a chamber of subtle psychological torment. Behind the genteel dinners and polite laughter lay a mounting dread that seeped into bones and thoughts alike. Some guests noticed the way the windows refused to show the outside world clearly, replaced by shadows that writhed just beyond the glass. Others felt the creeping weight of unseen eyes following them, a presence that stalked corridors and whispered from the corners. This was no ordinary gathering, but a ritual in slow motion, with each arrival another piece placed carefully into a macabre puzzle. Harrow watched, patient and unblinking, as his carefully curated environment pulled at the threads of their sanity, unraveling their sense of self with surgical precision. The house consumed their confidence and hope, replacing it with confusion and fear. The guests' ambitions, once bright and sharp, dulled into something fragile and cracked. They became prisoners not only of the mansion's shifting walls, but also of the invisible bonds Harrow wove around their minds. Here, innocence was a mask that peeled away slowly, revealing the raw terror beneath. As the night deepened and shadows lengthened into a suffocating blackness, the guests faced a truth they could neither speak nor fully understand: that the mansion was alive, a predator that hunted not flesh but the soul, devouring all that made them whole. From polite hospitality, the evening had descended into a quiet nightmare, the kind that creeps in unnoticed until escape feels impossible. And the only certainty is the slow, relentless decay of hope. At night, when the city's distant clatter dimmed and darkness seeped into every corner of the Scarlet Mansion, the walls began to whisper. It was not the wind or the creak of aging wood, but something more deliberate, soft, low murmurs that rose and fell like secret chants spoken just beyond hearing. The guests, once confident and composed, found themselves unable to dismiss these sounds, their minds twisting in response to the eerie rhythms that seeped through the floorboards and into their restless dreams. Footsteps echoed faintly, as if unseen figures paced the halls with purpose, never revealing themselves but always close enough to breed paranoia. There was a scraping noise, too, a slow grinding sound beneath the guests' feet, like claws raking the hidden spaces below, threatening to break through and tear at their sanity. These noises were not random, but part of the mansion's cruel design, a calculated symphony orchestrated by Jonathan Harrow to unravel those he had invited. The house became a living maze, every shadow a threat, every silence a trap. Guests found their thoughts fractured, memories slipping through their fingers like sand, replaced by rising dread that clung to their skin. The familiar room seemed to change when unobserved. Doors that once led to libraries now opened to narrow passages. Windows offered views not of the outside world but of darkness and shifting shapes. Their minds became the playground of unseen forces manipulated by Harrow's subtle rituals that preyed on fear itself. Whispers twisted into half-formed threats, voices that promised horrors if secrets were revealed or if resistance was attempted. Sleep became impossible, and waking moments blurred into nightmares, the boundary between reality and hallucination eroding with every hour. The guests' identities began to fracture as the mansion's whispered horrors seeped deeper, stripping away their sense of safety and self. Trust dissolved, alliances formed and broke without reason. The house was not just a building, but a predator feasting on vulnerability and despair. In this labyrinth of psychological torment, escape felt like a fading hope, and the walls closed in, swallowing the light and leaving only darkness behind. Deep within the heart of the Scarlet Mansion, Jonathan Harrow led his guests to a place few had ever seen. A hidden chamber tucked away behind a false wall, its entrance disguised beneath a tapestry that whispered secrets long forgotten. The room was small and claustrophobic, its walls padded with thick leather and lined with mirrors that stretched from floor to ceiling, reflecting every angle of the trapped soul within. This chamber was unlike any other part of the house. A cold laboratory where Harrow's obsession with control and psychological decay reached its darkest peak. Here, light bent unnaturally, refracted endlessly in the mirrored surfaces, creating an endless hall of reflections that shattered the boundaries between self and shadow. The room's silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of distant machinery and the quickened breathing of those trapped inside. Harrow's experiments were precise, a calculated assault on the mind and identity. Victims were stripped of all sensory input save the twisted images of themselves repeated infinitely in the mirrors. The reflections became cages, distorting faces into grotesque masks, twisting expressions of fear, confusion and despair into endless versions of the same broken self. In this cruel crucible, time lost meaning. Hours bled into days as the chamber's inmates faced nothing but their fractured images, their senses starved until reality itself frayed at the edges. Harrow observed with clinical detachment as the guests' personalities began to unravel, their sense of self slipping like water through trembling fingers. Memory faltered, voices in the mind multiplied, and the line between truth and illusion vanished. Some began to scream silently behind their own eyes, trapped in the prison of mirrors, their bodies inert while their minds shattered into fragments. This was no mere torture, but a ritualistic dismantling of identity, a slow, methodical erasure of the individual to reveal a raw, vulnerable core beneath. Harrow's fascination was not cruelty for its own sake, but the art of control, the breaking and remaking of the human spirit under his precise hand. The padded walls absorbed every sound, turning cries into muffled echoes that haunted the chamber's depths long after the doors were sealed. Those who emerged from the chamber of echoes were forever changed, hollowed out, their personalities splintered into shards that never quite fit together again. The mansion outside continued its silent watch, but inside this room the true horror of Jonathan Harrow's mind was laid bare. A relentless, ritualistic quest to conquer the fragile psyche, to crush the soul beneath the weight of endless, distorted reflection. As the echoes faded, the guests' broken minds were left to wander the mansion's twisting halls, shadows of their former selves, prisoners of a quiet evil that hid behind the mask of normalcy. One night, without warning or explanation, one of the guests simply vanished, a presence erased as if swallowed by the mansion itself. There was no scream, no struggle, no sign of departure. Only an empty chair at the dining table and the growing unease that crept through the remaining visitors like a cold shadow. This disappearance was no accident but a prelude to a sinister ritual Jonathan Harrow called the harvest. It was a slow, surgical stripping away of the senses, a cruel and methodical process designed to imprison the mind inside an unfeeling shell. Victims were isolated, their eyes covered with thick bandages, ears filled with wax and cloth, and skin numbed through strange ancient ointments that deadened touch without relief. One by one their senses dulled, sight, sound, touch, taste, and finally even the faintest sense of smell faded into nothingness. The body remained alive, breathing shallowly, but the world they knew slipped away into an endless void. This was a punishment unlike any other, an invisible death that tore away the essence of being without leaving a mark. The pain was not physical but existential, a torture so deep it gnawed at the soul itself. Trapped inside their own bodies, the victims became ghostly prisoners, aware but utterly powerless, sinking into a darkness that was as complete as it was merciless. Harrow moved among them like a surgeon and a priest, his hands steady, his face calm as he orchestrated the harvest with clinical precision. For him, this was the ultimate exercise in control, breaking down the self not through violence but through absence, through the gradual erasure of all that made a person whole. The mansion absorbed their silent suffering, its walls thick with the weight of despair that could not be voiced. Each harvested guest became a living tomb, their eyes vacant, their minds adrift in a sea of endless blackness. The others watched with a growing terror, knowing their own senses might be next to betray them, leaving them prisoners in their own flesh. The harvest was a slow death, unseen and unspeakable, a ritual of erasure that stripped away identity and hope until nothing remained but a husk, alive but utterly lost. It was in this darkness that Jonathan Harrow's deepest cruelty was revealed, not in blood and screams, but in silence so profound it crushed the will to live. The mansion's shadows thickened, feeding on the invisible pain as the guests slipped further from the world, one sense at a time, into the cold embrace of the harvest. Jonathan Harrow's fascination with control transformed into a dark, ritualistic art, one centered around the use of fine red silk threads, delicate yet deadly, that he wove with painstaking care into a web of suffering. These red threads were no mere instruments of restraint. They were symbols of domination, each one a silent sentence wrapped around flesh and bone. He bound his victims with surgical precision, threading the silk under skin, around fingers, and across throats, so that the threads became extensions of his will, cutting into muscle and sinew with a slow, merciless grip. The silk was soaked in substances that burned beneath the surface, invisible poisons that whispered of pain with every tiny movement. To Harrow, these threads were more than physical tools. They were psychological chains that linked the minds of his guests to his own fractured psyche. The red that stained the silk was the color of blood, but also of ritual sacrifice and binding oaths, weaving together the torment of body and spirit. His victims felt the threads tighten like vipers, an unending pressure that made them acutely aware of every nerve, every heartbeat, every breath caught between agony and submission. The thread sliced not to sever but to torment, each subtle cut a reminder that freedom was an illusion crafted and torn apart by the master of this cruel cathedral. This slow dance of pain was methodical, precise, and deeply ritualistic, each binding a ceremony, every knot a declaration of power. As the threads wrapped tighter, so did Harrow's hold on their minds, bending their wills until they became echoes of his own desires. The victim's resistance faded, replaced by a twisted acceptance, a dark communion in which their suffering became a form of worship. The mansion around them seemed to pulse with the thread's silent song, a web of cruelty spun from shadows and silk, binding body and soul in an unbreakable embrace. Jonathan's obsession was not madness unchecked, but a carefully crafted doctrine, a chilling testament to a mind that found beauty in the meticulous unraveling of others. Through the ritual of the red thread, he claimed dominion over his guests not just as captives, but as living vessels of his macabre vision. An invisible force weaving through flesh, binding them forever to the cold heart of the Crimson Mansion. The mansion's grand dining hall, once a place of light laughter and clinking glasses, had become the stage for a grotesque inversion of hospitality that echoed Jonathan Harrow's fractured mind. Here the guests were forced to partake in what Harrow called the hollow feast, a ritual far removed from any notion of comfort or nourishment. The tables were set with delicate silverware and fine china, but the dishes they served were far from food. These symbolic meals were concoctions of bitter, viscous substances infused with hallucinogens and corrosive compounds designed to erode both flesh and mind. Each bite burned like acid beneath the tongue, a chemical dissolution that invaded the body silently, unraveling muscle, bone, and nerve with cruel inevitability. But the physical pain was only the surface of this ritual. The hallucinogens twisted perception, opening dark corridors within the mind where memories warped, fears amplified, and reality bled into nightmare. Victims convulsed in their seats, trapped in a waking dream where their own bodies betrayed them, rotting from within as visions of terror and despair flooded their senses. This grotesque act was no mere punishment. It was a perverse communion with Harrow's twisted psyche, a forced ingestion of his own darkness and decay. Through the hollow feast, the guests were bound to the mansion and its master in a way deeper than chains or locks, each agonized swallow a step closer to becoming extensions of his deranged will. The room pulsed with a sickening rhythm of suffering and submission, the guests' bodies convulsing in quiet horror while their minds fractured under the weight of chemical and psychological assault. Harrow watched with cold satisfaction as they dissolved piece by piece, a slow, merciless unmaking that fed his obsession with control and decay. The feast was a sacrament of destruction, a ritualized consumption that left nothing whole, only hollow shells tethered to the mansion's insatiable hunger. In this perverse banquet, cruelty found its purest form, silent, unrelenting, and intimately bound to the hidden madness of a man who hid his evil beneath a mask of civility. The mansion was no mere building but a living entity, its walls pulsing with a hunger that fed not on flesh but on the raw, trembling essence of pain and fear. It absorbed the terror that seeped from its captive guests as if it drank their very souls, growing heavier and darker with every whispered scream and every silent tear. The structure itself seemed to breathe beneath their feet, its floors shifting subtly, corridors twisting into impossible shapes that defied logic and reason. Rooms that once felt familiar became alien prisons, doors appearing where none existed before and vanishing just as suddenly, trapping victims in endless loops of confusion and despair. Staircases spiraled into darkness, leading nowhere but back to where they began, while windows revealed only shifting shadows instead of the world outside. This architecture of madness was no accident. It was a predator's web woven by Jonathan Harrow's cruel design, a carefully crafted trap meant to dismantle not only bodies but minds. The mansion's hunger was insatiable and unseen, a silent force that preyed on vulnerability and whispered of doom with every creak and groan. Guests found themselves caught in its relentless grasp, their footsteps echoing in hallways that stretched like the jaws of some monstrous beast. Each attempt to escape only tightened the invisible chains, leaving them more lost, more broken. The house's appetite was endless, feeding on the rising dread that gnawed at their hearts, turning hope into dust. Harrow's twisted mind had made the mansion not just a place of torture but a living predator that consumed everything it touched, leaving behind hollowed shells of those who dared to enter. As the walls closed in and shadows lengthened, the guests understood at last that their captor was not just a man but a monstrous force embodied in brick and mortar, a darkness that thrived in silence and secrecy. The house's hunger was eternal, and its feast had only just begun. Amid the suffocating dread that had settled over the Scarlet Mansion like a shroud, one guest refused to succumb to the slow unraveling that had claimed so many others. Driven by a desperate need for understanding, this visitor began to peel back the layers of Jonathan Harrow's carefully constructed facade, uncovering fragments of a past as dark and fractured as the mansion itself. Harrow's childhood was a tale buried beneath whispered rumors. A childhood marked by cruel abandonment in the cold, indifferent hands of strangers who saw not a boy, but an experiment in human fragility. He had been left to wander shadowed corridors of orphanages where secret societies whispered of forbidden knowledge, occult rites passed down in hushed reverence, and ancient promises of power through pain. These dark affiliations had shaped him, planting seeds of obsession that grew into the monstrous mind behind the crimson walls. The mansion was no mere home, but a temple of ritualistic psychosis, an altar where Harrow enacted his perverse vision of transcendence. He believed suffering was the key to breaking the limits of human existence, a crucible in which the mind could be purified, expanded, and remade. Every torment inflicted upon his guests was part of this grim doctrine, a step in a ceremonial descent meant to dissolve ordinary boundaries and unlock something beyond sanity itself. The mansion's shifting halls and endless reflections were tools for this terrible alchemy, designed to fracture the self until only raw, exposed consciousness remained, fragile, vulnerable, and utterly open to transformation. This was Harrow's dark quest, a journey not just of cruelty but of twisted enlightenment, where pain was both weapon and sacrament. As the guest uncovered these secrets, a chilling realization took hold. The mansion was a living altar, its very stones soaked with the anguish and broken wills of those who had come before. The rituals were not madness alone, but a carefully choreographed pilgrimage into the abyss, led by a mind that wore innocence as a mask. while orchestrating horrors that blurred the line between human and something other. The final descent was not merely physical but spiritual, a plunge into depths where the self was dismantled and reconstructed in the image of Harrow's deranged vision. This revelation cast a new shadow over the guests still trapped within the house, transforming fear into a dreadful clarity. Their suffering was part of a grander design, one that transcended mere cruelty and touched on the forbidden edges of human experience. In that moment, the mansion ceased to be just a prison and became a dark cathedral where the twisted psychology of one man sought to remake the world in his own shattered image. The path forward was no longer about escape, but about confronting the abyss that Jonathan Harrow had made his home, and that now threatened to consume all who remained. The mansion's horrors spilled into the waking world in fragments. Disjointed reports from police raids, whispered confessions from those barely clinging to sanity, and the shattered remnants of lives forever altered. The investigators who arrived found rooms stripped bare, hidden chambers sealed tight, and a silence so thick it seemed to press against their minds. Yet no matter how deep they searched, the full extent of Jonathan Harrow's darkness remained elusive, slipping through their fingers like smoke. Harrow himself vanished without a trace, disappearing into the shadows he had so carefully woven around himself, leaving behind a legacy soaked in blood and pain. The city spoke of him in hushed tones, a man who had worn the mask of civility while constructing a temple of torment, a predator whose appetite was as limitless as the mansion's shifting walls. The grand house was sealed, barred from the public eye, but its presence never faded. Instead, it festered in the collective nightmare of the city, a dark myth that haunted dreams and lurked in the corners of whispered conversations. The broken guests, scattered and silent, carried the mansion's scars beneath their skin and deep within their minds. Their fragmented stories a testament to the unseen cruelty that had unfolded behind crimson doors. Jonathan's legacy was not just the ruined bodies and shattered psyches left in his wake, but the chilling reminder that evil often wears the mask of normalcy, hiding patiently until it can strike again. The mansion, now a sealed crypt of forgotten horrors, remained a silent sentinel to the depths of human darkness, a haunting monument to a mind that dared to twist suffering into a form of transcendence and to a nightmare that refuses to die. Decades after the Crimson Mansion was sealed and its owner vanished into obscurity, a new generation of historians and psychologists began to unearth the fractured legacy Jonathan Harrow had left behind. Their investigations, pieced together through faded diaries, whispered testimonies, and secret correspondences, revealed unsettling traces of Harrow's methods bleeding into the fabric of society's darker undercurrents. These documents spoke of ritualistic psychosis, slow sensory deaths, and the chilling use of symbolic bindings, elements that echoed far beyond the mansion's walls and seeped into underground cults and shadowy institutions hidden in plain sight. Scholars noted that Harrow's obsessive control, his manipulation of mind and body through elaborate rituals, had become a blueprint for those seeking power through suffering. A silent doctrine passed down in clandestine circles where normalcy masked unfathomable cruelty. The mansion itself had long since been torn down or claimed by time, but the patterns it embodied persisted, like a virus infecting human institutions designed to maintain order. The chilling idea took hold that the horrors once confined to that Scarlet House were not isolated relics of the past, but symptoms of a recurring darkness, one that thrives in silence, wrapped in civility, and waiting patiently beneath the surface of everyday life. Interviews with survivors and descendants uncovered subtle signs of lingering trauma, suggesting that Harrow's influence was more than historical. It was psychological, an inheritance of fear and fractured identity passed through generations. This realization unsettled the collective consciousness, forcing a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that evil does not always announce itself with violence or chaos. Often it operates quietly, wrapped in routine and ritual, camouflaged by normalcy, and perpetuated by those who believe in its power to transcend humanity itself. As researchers delved deeper, they found themselves peering into a dark mirror reflecting not only a man's madness but also the shadows lurking in institutions and minds still susceptible to control and cruelty. The mansion may have crumbled, its walls reduced to dust, but the echoes of its ritualistic psychosis haunted modern times, a persistent reminder that some evils never truly die. They merely evolve, hidden in the folds of society's collective nightmare, waiting to be awakened once more. True evil rarely announces itself with grand gestures or blazing fury. It creeps in quietly, wrapped in the familiar cloth of normalcy, hiding behind the masks society trusts without question. Jonathan Harrow was not a monster in the streets, but a man of civility, charm, and meticulous routine. His cruelty concealed beneath a polished facade that disarmed suspicion and invited trust. This is the terrifying nature of darkness that thrives in silence. It waits patiently, blending seamlessly with the everyday, feeding on the blind spots of human perception and the fragile trust we place in appearances. The Scarlet Mansion, with its shifting halls and whispered horrors, was merely a physical manifestation of a deeper, more insidious truth. That evil often resides not in the shadows, but in plain sight, in the quiet spaces where no one dares to look too closely. The line between civility and savagery is perilously thin, a fragile barrier held together by social norms and self-delusion, vulnerable to being shattered by a mind like Harrow's that understands how to manipulate, to control, and to conceal. This slow, deliberate decay of trust and identity, masked as normal life, challenges the very foundations of what it means to be safe, to be human. As viewers reflect on the chilling legacy of the Crimson Mansion and the man who orchestrated its nightmare, they are asked to confront a haunting question. Could this nightmare happen again? The answer lies not in distant legends or forgotten places, but in the everyday interactions, the quiet corners of society where cruelty can be masked by smiles and silence. The documentary closes with this somber meditation, urging vigilance and awareness, reminding us that evil's most dangerous form is the one we fail to see, the evil that hides in plain sight, patiently waiting for the moment to rise once more.